Hey, what's up, Potsers? Let's take a look at this attacking game by the great player Alexander Alekhine. In this game, he had the white pieces against Richard Teichman, and he started with e4, e5, knight c3, so we have a Vienna. And after knight c6, bishop c4, knight f6, calmly d3, maybe considering an f4 push. When I play the Vienna, I'll be honest, I don't know very much about it, but I rarely play it. And when I do, I often go for this early f4 push, something like knight e2 and f4. It could also be played in a King's Gambit style with f4 right away before playing knight f3. And after bishop c5, we do have this f4 idea. Okay, black plays d6, and now knight f3. So white can be pretty happy with their development. Pieces are on their natural squares, and he's managed to get this move f4 in pretty early. And so here, black plays bishop g4, pinning the knight on f3. Another possibility for black would have been to play bishop e6. This is sort of a more solid choice, trying to just equalize. Then, in his notes to the game, Alekhine mentions play may continue with something like bishop e5, a6, exchanging on c6 to double the pawns, and then queen e2. The idea is white can't castle because the bishop on c5 is sort of bothering us, and so by playing queen e2, we're preparing bishop e3 to exchange off the dark squared bishops when castling would be possible again. Okay, but after pawn takes e5, bishop takes, black gets to castle first. But the bishop simply retreats to e3, takes, and even something like knight g4 wouldn't be too disruptive because the queen could simply come back to e2, and white has the ability to castle in either direction, but simply 0-0 here. And the position is probably equal. You might argue it's a tad tiny little bit better for white just because of these doubled pawns, but it's probably equal. A very solid position for black. Okay, but instead of that bishop e6 solid line, black went for bishop g4, so looking to sort of complicate things, creating a pin, possibly hoping to play knight d4 at an opportune moment. And so here, how do you respond if you're playing with white? Covering this square is kind of tricky. You can't play bishop e3, obviously. If you play something like knight e2, you'll get doubled pawns here. So how do we address this? Well, Alekhine, he played knight a4. So the idea is putting pressure on this bishop. But he also mentioned that there were some lines he considered with h3. These aren't quite as promising as how the game goes. These leave black with an advantage. For instance, after bxf3, qxf3, pawn takes f4, it would be really nice to complete development and play bishop takes f4. But this move doesn't quite work because after knight d4, black is hitting the queen and the pawn on c2, forcing the queen back to d1 in order to defend, and this gives black an extra tempo to be the first one to castle. And it's worth noting that white's pieces, while the center looks very nice, don't allow him to castle just yet. He probably has to play something like queen d2, maybe hoping to castle queenside. Castling kingside would fail because of the reveal. Simply knight takes c2 check would be a problem. And so because of that, bishop takes f4 would not be correct, but rather queen takes f4 when, okay, the position probably close to equal. Black can castle, and white will be able to complete their development as well and castle, and not very much is happening. So instead of this h3 move, which would have led to those simplifications, Alekhine plays the move knight a4, going after this powerful bishop. Black responds with a6, hoping to retain the bishop. If given an extra turn, certainly he would have retained it. But it's worth mentioning, okay, why not bishop takes f3 now? Well, it's certainly playable, but it gives white a little edge. After queen takes f3, knight d4 is a move that again would suggest itself. The queen again returns to d1 to hold on to the c2 square. And now comes this move b5, which is a pawn fork. A really nice pawn fork that kind of makes this knight on a4 seem like a blunder. But there is a way to sort of wiggle out of this for white. What would you play here? So Alekhine plays the swashbuckling move bishop takes f7 check, or rather he didn't play it but mentioned it in his notes. After king takes, knight takes bishop, pawn takes e5, probably knight d7. White is going to be able to castle with check and then play c3, evict this knight. And even though he's down a knight, he did get 2 pawns for it. And this central pawn mass, black's displaced pieces and poorly placed king, more than compensate for it. In fact, my engine is showing that white has an advantage here of a little bit more than a pawn. So that's significant if you're down a piece for 2 pawns and the engine likes your position. That means your attacking prospects are pretty good. Okay, but that did not occur in the game because after this move, knight a4, a6, knight takes c5 is played, pawn takes, and now, oh, actually there was one other little variation here that I wanted to check out. After knight a4, we had a6, and now, so we looked at this bishop takes f3 line, but pawn takes f4 is another sort of interesting idea here in this position that has some of the similar ideas we looked at before in terms of pulling the bishop out and maybe getting in knight d4 with a little tempo on the pinned knight. If instead of a6, if pawn takes f4 is played, then now knight takes bishop, d takes c5, bishop takes c4. The position is pretty good for white. White has the 2 bishops and a nice pawn center. These double pawns may be a long-term problem for black. Now, black could try for the initiative, but it doesn't quite work. In fact, it blows up spectacularly. If he were to play something like knight h5, attacking this bishop on f4, the bishop could simply retreat. And after knight e5, the bishop came to e3 to hold on to this d4 square. So if this knight wants to attack the pinned knight on f3 again, it can't use d4, but rather has to come to e4. E5, sorry. After knight e5, then comes this incredible unpinning move that works. If black takes the queen, here comes check. Bishop takes f7 check. The king steps forward. Bishop takes c5 check. It's important to note bishop g5 check would not win the queen back. The knight could just rubber band back to f6. But bishop takes c5 leads to mate. Notice how all of the squares around black's king are controlled but for f6, so the king has to go on a little bit of a walk. Here comes castling with check, and after king takes knight, there's checkmate on the board. Rook f5, game over. Okay, that's sort of an amusing sideline. Well, at least I found it somewhat amusing, but okay, pawn takes f4 was not played, and even if it had been played, probably just castles and not this knight h5 stuff would be better for black. But in any case, after a6, knight takes, pawn takes, now 0-0. Queen e7, looking to hold together the center, possibly considering queenside castling. Finally, white plays h3, and after an exchange on f3, black castles kingside. Okay. It's interesting to note that white has not yet developed the bishop on c1, and so his rooks are not yet connected. But on the other hand, he does have a few small sort of positional pluses. One would be these doubled c-pawns, but two, and it's a pretty big one, he has the bishop pair versus the knight pair in the kind of position that probably will favor the bishops. Let's see. So after bishop e3, now black decides to take on f4, and queen takes. Knight e5 is played, touching the c4 bishop. After bishop e3, rook e8, rook a e8, bringing another rook to the center. It's interesting to consider, though, here possibly just c4 as a move for black. The idea is, after, for instance, c4 now, white could take this pawn, but black would have gotten rid of his doubled pawn and saddled white with these doubled pawns, leaving the e4 pawn weak and possibly shutting this bishop out of the game, at least for a little while. So this move, c4 here, definitely would have been an improvement over what Teichman played, which was rook e8. Okay, and so now queen f2 is played. c4 now probably not possible because there is a little idea of bishop c5 with a pin on the queen and the rook. Knight d7, defending against this move. And now simply bringing another rook into the game. b6 to overprotect the c5 square. And now c3, possibly building up a breakthrough on d4 someday, which is already supported by the rook, as well as the bishop and the queen. So the d4 square is really well guarded or defended or attacked, really, because when this pawn comes crashing through the center, it will probably be difficult for black to deal with. So black plays knight g6, which anticipates this pawn d4 move. His thought process is probably something like, okay, I see that d4 is coming, so I'll get my knight out of the center. And if you just take a moment and look at the chessboard, black's pieces are in these extremely cramped and defensive sort of posture around black's king, whereas white's bishops are exerting some pressure in the center as well as on the king side, and the open f-file also looks very tempting for attacking prospects. All right, and so queen f5. Queen centralization, hard to improve this bishop, or really this one either at the moment. After king h8, though, it's a sort of an interesting moment, right? Because how do you continue? What do you play? What would your plan be? Well, the first thing that I sort of thought of when I saw this position was maybe double rooks, maybe rook d2 and rook f2 with the idea of tripling on the f-file. But that's not really the best plan because black can always play f6 and sort of leave our heavy pieces staring at that square. And for now, e5 is still under control. But the other reason that I think doubling on the file is, or tripling on this file is probably not the best move is white does want to play d4. So maybe d4 now could be a useful move, although we would drop the e4 pawn. And so what to do? Alekhine comes up with a really nice positional maneuver. He decides that his bishop on e3 is the piece that needs to be improved, and he decides to target the weakness on the queen side. So kind of a seesaw, going from attacking the king side with everything, planning this d4 move, and then retreat to f2 and g3 to target the c7 pawn. So he's giving black something to think about on both sides of the board. You might say this is an example of the theory of two weaknesses, where if you're attacking only one weakness, the opponent could easily defend, but if you start to attack two different weaknesses, then their defenses at some point break down. Okay, knight to e5 is played, and here's the perfect moment. d4, there it is, boom. Hitting the knight, hitting c5, come crashing through the center. Okay, so after takes, white has this beautiful pawn duo. The knight has to retreat to c6, and the pawns march d5, The knight returns to e5, just wasting several tempo back and forth. And here comes h4. A very creative move, and again, a theme we've seen in Aлекhine's games time and again is when he has all of his pieces optimally placed, he introduces a pawn move into the attack. And here, h4 enters the scene with decisive effect. The threat is simply h5, kicking the knight away. Black plays queen c5 check, and after king h2, f6 to try and slow down the pressure on f7, I would imagine. This also gives this knight a square possibly to run away to, although it's not a very pretty one. And so here, you know, what should White do? What's the plan? Where should we go next? Of course, there are a few moves that sort of suggest themselves, but which one would you play? I would be tempted to play h5 right away. It's in keeping with the attack, and it makes sense. Alekhine notices this square on e6 and finds a way to put a piece there, beginning with rook c1, hitting the queen. She runs to d6, giving him another tempo to come here, using this pin so the knight cannot take on c6. And after the queen moves, rook e6. So a really nice redeployment of this rook to a more useful square. The queen steps away to d7, and now here comes the move h5. White's pieces are just really poorly coordinated right now, and I'm sorry, White's pieces are amazingly coordinated. Black's pieces are just really poorly coordinated right now and unable to defend against all of these threats. Let's see here. Alekhine plays queen h3. I think h6 there right away would have been interesting as well, but queen h3 certainly makes it even more tempting. And so Black plays knight f7, anticipating this move and defending it again. So simply playing h6 now, Black would take the pawn. He prepares it with bishop f4, and the threat now is maybe greater than the execution because Black responds with h6. So in order to stop White from coming crashing through on h6, Black plays h6 himself. Of course, this square is now what you may call a hook. It's certainly a target for a sacrifice, and we'll see how that plays out in the game. Queen c3, changing the theater back to the c7 weakness. So again, he's using this theory of two weaknesses seesaw effect, attacking on the king side, the h6 point, and now returning to the queen side to pull Black's defenses to the c7 pawn, or at least his attention. Knight c6, interfering with the bishop's attack on c7, at least for now. And here comes a really nice finish to the game. What would you play? So here's the moment for bishop takes h6. The move sort of suggests itself, of course. If Black were to take the bishop right away and accept the sacrifice, then rook captures f6 would just be devastation. There's no way to hold on to this pawn, and mate is sure to follow. If, rook takes, we have queen takes check, and king g8, and okay, this looks pretty bad. Rook takes knight is probably good enough for the win, threatening the queen and checkmate in one. For a moment, my engine preferred e5 over rook takes knight, which is just speaks to how crushing this position is for White. Okay, and so capturing the bishop is not possible. But after bishop takes f6 in the game, knight takes e4 was played, a sort of last-ditch effort to win a tempo, maybe kick some dust into the air and escape. But now simply rook takes e4, and after knight takes d5, queen c1, a really nice move. If pawn takes bishop, Black was hoping, probably, that after queen takes h6, queen h7 would defend, but White has this in-between move, bishop takes d5, and after queen takes, now queen takes h6 is going to be devastation. It's made in a it's made eventually in maybe 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 more moves here. I'm tempted to play Queen G7, but my engine likes just Rook E1, which sets up a mate in 1 threat, and I guess after Queen D6 check, King H1, now Black is out of ways to defend and has to start pitching material with Queen E5. Okay, so because of that, back here, Black actually resigned before Bishop, before any of that occurred because he saw the writing on the wall. All right, a really interesting game, a nice example of the theory of two weaknesses attacking on both sides of the board. I hope you guys enjoyed this one as much as I did.